When I was studying, a teacher once said, "Don't think that the history of the whole of China is the same, and Shaanxi has never experienced the Southern Song dynasty." I suddenly realized how deep-rooted the historical inertia cognition existed in my mind. I have studied history for many years, but I did not realize the differences in regional history. Just like the reasoning in this article, we are too accustomed to our own historical narrative, and often ignore Taiwan's own history. If you still believe that history is inextricably linked with the present, please take a good look at this article discussing Taiwan's historical memory. To respect it, you need to understand its history. Liao Xinzong, the author of this article, was born in Taiwan in 1977 and now lives in the mainland. Author of Our Taiwanese Years, Our Taiwanese Years 2 and The Motherland Taiwan Knows Over These Years. On the 70th anniversary of the victory of the anti-Japanese war, Beijing held a grand military parade. In terms of the National Army, it also held a number of military demonstrations and small-scale military parades. Beijing invited veterans of the anti-Japanese war to participate in the military parade, and the National Army also awarded the anti-Japanese war commemorative medals to veterans. Not limited to mainland Taiwan, anyone can apply. Beijing said that the Communist Party was the mainstay of the war of resistance, and the National Army said that it fought several large-scale and tragic battles. When I was young, there was a one-armed old man downstairs. At that time, I only knew that it was blown up in the previous air raid. Once I asked very ignorantly, "Did the Japanese blow it up?" I remember he just smiled silently. Without saying anything, I thought to myself, the Japanese are too hateful to attack Taiwan by air. One day, when the school taught the Japanese occupation era, my mind suddenly boomed, yes. During the Japanese occupation era, Taiwan was the land of Japan. Why did the Japanese air attack Taiwan? Then, for me, the more cruel fact is that the air attack on Taiwan was done by the Americans. However, the United States was not our ally during the War of Resistance. Why airstrike Taiwan? I found out later that at the end of World War II, Japan, like Taiwan, was attacked by American bombers almost every day. It turns out that the old man said that before avoiding air raids, he was not hiding from Japanese planes, but from American planes. What? The National Army has air raided Taiwan. After I knew these things, I felt extremely painful and depressed for a long time. The governments on both sides of the Taiwan Strait competed for the right to speak on the issue of the 70th anniversary of the anti-Japanese war. However, in Taiwanese society, a group of people are commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Taipei air raid, in which 3,000 people died. A commemoration of the victory of the anti-Japanese war. Different regions, different political stances, and different ethnic groups have different memories. In 1895, the Qing dynasty was defeated in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and Taiwan was ceded to Japan. Since then, Taiwan and the mainland have embarked on two different paths, gradually drifting apart. The Qing government lost the Sino-Japanese War in the north, and as a result, the fate of Taiwan, a small and irrelevant island in the southeast, changed. When the Qing government decided to cede Taiwan, it was a helpless fate for the Taiwanese. Japan's colonial rule of Taiwan for 50 years, half a century, several generations, the impact on Taiwan will certainly not be erased. Taiwan is Japan's southward base. Japan spared no effort to build Taiwan while plundering Taiwan's resources. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan defeated China and Russia one after another, and became one of the imperialist powers. Taiwan is Japan's first overseas colony. At that time, all the old imperialist powers in Europe were looking at Japan's ability, and Japan also had reasons not to admit defeat. Taiwan became a place for Japan to experiment with many new technologies, and new methods were often tried in Taiwan first. No one can deny that the foundation of Taiwan's modernization was completed during the Japanese occupation era. While Japan was colonizing Taiwan, what happened on the mainland? The Boxer Rebellion, the Eight-Power Allied Forces, the National Revolution, the Northern Expedition, the Central Plains War, the War of Resistance against Japan, the war, and then the war, which seemed to be an endless war, and the war was chaotic for decades. In contrast, apart from frequent air raids at the end of the Pacific War, Taiwanese lived a relatively peaceful life. Taiwanese lived their own lives and basically didn't care about what happened on the mainland. I also discovered another thing that shocked me. The Nanjing government of the Republic of China at that time had a consulate general in Taipei from 1931 to 1938, the year of the September 18th incident, and the year after the anti-Japanese war. When I uncovered the history that I didn't know before, I felt confused when I was young. I was eager to know why. Mainland China also needs to apply for visas at the Chinese consulate in Taipei. Every October 10th, the Double Tenth Festival, the Taipei Consulate General holds a Double Tenth cocktail party, inviting diplomatic envoys and expatriates from various countries in Taipei to participate, and the Japanese governor's office will also send congratulations. Until 1938, the Consulate General continued to negotiate with the Japanese Governor General's office over the evacuation of overseas Chinese, and finally rented a ship from a third country to evacuate the overseas Chinese, lowered the flag, and closed the consulate. Passport issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of China in 1933. Go to AIA Japan Taiwan Taipei State. What? This question is getting bigger and bigger in my mind. Where were the Taiwanese people in those years? This confuses me completely. In terms of spirituality, the first priority of the Japanese colonists was of course to erase the concept of being Chinese in the minds of Taiwanese. At the end of the 19th century, Go Du Xinpiai, Chief Civil Affairs Officer of Taiwan's Governor's Office, and later the Mayor of Tokyo, believed that Taiwanese had all the bad habits of Chinese people. He summed it up into three things: fear of death, love of money, and good face. View. Go Du Xinpiai said, the rough and naive local people cannot understand the idea of civil rights, and the civilized criminal law and civil law in Japan cannot be applied in Taiwan. Therefore, it is appropriate to implement a legal system based on local traditions and customs in Taiwan. On the one hand, Taiwan is governed with a strict legal system, and on the other hand, it uses the characteristics of fear of death, love of money, and good face to often give some small favors. Of course, the ultimate intention of all this is to spiritually reform the Taiwanese to be exactly like the Japanese. The Japanese who came to Taiwan were not only bureaucrats and soldiers, but also ordinary people from all walks of life. On the streets of Taipei in 1920, there were even Japanese rickshaw drivers. If you go to Hualien in eastern Taiwan, you can also find the immigrant pioneer village of that year. The generation that has been seated and changed hands is gradually getting old and unable to resist. The new generation of Taiwanese grow up in the relative environment of Japanese education, Japanese neighbors, Japanese teachers, Japanese police, Japanese colleagues, and the Japanese government. After getting up, the concept of the mainland of the motherland is becoming increasingly blurred. A dialogue in the movie Sedik Bale, in another 20 years, the next generation in the family will all become Japanese. The Japanese brought qualitative changes to Taiwan. As for spiritual thinking, the Japanese think that Taiwanese are colonial people. If they absorb too many advanced thoughts, the wisdom of the people will not be conducive to management, so you will see that even if it is higher education, the Japanese only allow Taiwanese to study science, engineering, and medicine, and do not allow Taiwanese to study political science and law. In front of pure Japanese, Taiwanese are second-class citizens after all. Make more and more progress, after all, life is aggrieved. The movie Sedik Bale discusses what exactly is the civilization brought by Japan, which is almost the core of the debate on the historical view of Japanese occupation. Li Tenghui once said that 70 years ago, Japan and Taiwan were one and the same country, and he also stated the facts. The vast majority of Taiwanese did not participate in the war against Japan, but Taiwanese did resist Japan. Different ethnic groups in the world once resisted, whether they were military or cultural, but they were not successful, and their successors were weak, and they were quickly suppressed. However, there are many passionate young intellectuals who have a heart for the motherland. They tried their best to study in China. After the outbreak of the anti-Japanese war, they joined the army, joined the guerrillas, and even participated in the communist revolution. This raises a question worth pondering. It is also a Japanese colony. Why is the anti-Japanese sentiment in Taiwan not as high as that in South Korea in the decades after the war, and even somewhat pro-Japanese? One very interesting thing is that the Taiwanese were crying bitterly while listening to the Emperor's Yuan broadcast one moment, and then suddenly realized that they were the victorious side, and welcomed the motherland to receive it with joy and encouragement. I often think about two questions. First, if it was not Taiwan that was ceded in 1895, if it was Shandong, perhaps Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Fujian, what kind of historical memories would the residents of these places have? How would you feel about Japan? Will the general mainland's criticism of Taiwan's pro-Japanese and Japanese favorite be used to describe these places in the same way? Second, since 1895, Taiwan didn't know much about what happened in the mainland, didn't know what the Communist Party was, and didn't know what the struggle between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party was, and it was suddenly involved in the Civil War. China, instead of a China that is about to enter a civil war, will all these difficult problems not exist now? In the movie A City of Sadness, the Taiwanese intellectuals in the early days of the Restoration yearned to imitate everything about the motherland. In this section, Ho Xiaoxian specially arranged for them to sing along with the Exile trilogy, but they sang out of tune. When the National Army came to Taiwan, Taiwanese people really welcomed it, but unfortunately, at that time, Taiwanese people were very disappointed with the recipients of the national government coming to Taiwan. For example, they saw the National Army who looked like beggars. They saw corruption and incompetence compared with the surrendered and disarmed Japanese troops standing aside, compared with the rigor of the Japanese before. It is a huge psychological gap. Soon after the national government took over Taiwan, the society regressed obviously. Many people believed that the Japanese plundered Taiwan's resources, but they also knew how to invest in sustainable management. The mainland went to support the Civil War, which led to financial chaos and skyrocketing prices. The people's feelings are the most direct. The behavior and quality of the government personnel are seen by the people. They are far inferior to the Japanese in the past. A popular saying at the time, dogs go to pigs, Japanese dogs, Chinese pigs. Dogs can also see at home, pigs just eat, pull, and sleep. Big officials are corrupt, and small officials are small. How big is that sense of loss? Mainlanders who come to Taiwan, how do they feel when they see Taiwanese society? The mainland had just finished fighting the war of resistance against Japan, and drove away the bloody Japanese invaders. As a result, when they came to Taiwan, they would find it unpleasant to see the Japanese everywhere, and then they would repel them and look down on them, criticizing Taiwanese for being enslaved. Is the emperor? Are these adjectives familiar? When the Japanese ruled Taiwan, they also called Taiwanese slaves of the Qing dynasty. During the 50 years of Japanese occupation, Taiwan was oppressed by the colonial regime on the one hand, and on the other hand, the motherland considered Taiwan to be the territory of Japan, without the support of the mainland, and suffered discrimination and exclusion between the colonial master and the motherland. Was once listed as the 23rd among the top 100 Chinese novels by Asia Weekly. Wu Zuliu's novel The Orphan of Asia is about these things. A Taiwanese intellectual in the Japanese occupation era yearned for the motherland wholeheartedly, and he was oppressed in Japan, finally waited until the recovery, and was discriminated against and misunderstood because he was not considered a Chinese after arriving in the mainland. After a series of blows, he gradually became cognitively confused, and finally went crazy and ended in tragedy. Do you think Orphans of Asia is the song sung by Luo Dao, referring to the lonely army in northern Thailand? No, that refers to Taiwan. The regimes that rule and manage the land of Taiwan come and go. The Spaniards came, the Dutch came, the Ming-Zheng came, the Qing dynasty came, the Japanese came, and finally the KMT came. You say live on this land, do people have the right to choose? No matter who comes, grit your teeth and don't want to live. Some people say that the people who are most qualified to call themselves Taiwanese are Taiwan's Aboriginal Jason people. I asked an Aboriginal friend, what does 1945 mean to you, and he jokingly replied, colonized again. The idea that Taiwanese were deeply enslaved by the Japanese was the mainstream in the eyes of those who came to Taiwan from the mainland at that time. You will see that after the 228 incident, after the full-scale conflict broke out, the officials still used this as the reason to explain the main cause of the incident. The anger of the same group of intellectuals in the movie City of Sadness after the 228 incident. Pen Mingmin, who is considered the godfather of Taiwan poison, mentioned in his autobiography The Taste of Freedom that his intellectual father suffered after the 228 incident. Father was completely disillusioned. From then on, he no longer participates in Chinese politics, or cares about Chinese public affairs. What he tastes is the grief of a betrayed idealist, and he even threatens to be ashamed of his Chinese blood. Like Pen Mingmin's father, who experienced the generation that Taiwan was ceded 50 years ago, and saw the uprising against Japan in various places in the first 2 decades, and the group of people who hated the country and the family, all have this kind of emotion, let alone those who were born in the past 50 years. It can be said that the group of people who imagined the motherland personally destroyed the group of intellectuals and influential Taiwanese intellectuals who still yearned for the motherland even under Japanese rule. In 1949, the Kuomintang brought 1.5 million people to Taiwan. This small island with only 6 million people suddenly increased its population by a quarter. Taiwan became a rejuvenation base and a springboard for anti-communism. Society and all aspects are prepared for the continent of anti-Gong. Although Chiang Kai-shek relies heavily on the white group formed by the former Japanese military officer corps militarily, and is also close to Japan, which is also an East Asian island chain, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of education, the Kuomintang implements education combined with politics in Taiwan. It was quite successful. On the one hand, it appealed to counterattack, and on the other hand, it emphasized hatred against Japan, so that for a long time, the history of 50 years of Japanese occupation did not exist in the history of Taiwan. It disappeared, and the next time it reappeared, it was Taiwan's recovery. In the middle 50 years, what was Taiwan doing? People like me who were born in the 1970s thought that the Revolutionary Northern Expedition and the War of Resistance would be equivalent to directly transplanting the 50 years of history that took place in the mainland to Taiwan for 50 years. I went to a symposium not long ago. An old man talked about their life in a certain county in the enemy-occupied area. They open the shop in the morning and close it at dusk. Sometimes they go to other places to buy goods. They climb over several mountains to guard against bandits. They still set off firecrackers during New Year's Eve dinner, and their life has not changed much except that they have to be inspected by Japanese soldiers when entering and leaving the city. At this time, a middle-aged man jumped up and yelled, "Traitor and running dog." The implication is, why do you live on an ignoble existence? Why didn't you rise up and resist? Why didn't you follow and escape to the rear? Perhaps life under the enemy's occupation is considered politically incorrect and disgraceful, so we avoid mentioning it. On the mainland, historical research on the War of Resistance is often done on the battlefield, in the rear, and in the enemy's rear, but rarely listened to. I have mentioned the living conditions of the people under enemy occupation. Maybe the enemy-occupied area is too large, and the experience of each place is different, but it cannot be denied that no matter how oppressed, no matter how much suffering, even if they linger on, life still exists. After the war, the new generation of Taiwanese remember Chinese history clearly, but they don't know what happened in their hometown during those 50 years. They know the provinces through which the Yellow River and Yangtze River flow, but they can't list the counties in Taiwan from north to south. City, they sang Great Wall ballads to sing praises outside the customs, but they couldn't sing the folk songs in their mother tongue. Wu Nianzhen's autobiographical film Duo Sang tells about the difference in ideology between the father who was educated under the Japanese occupation and the children who were born and educated after the war, causing many family disputes. For more than 100 years, Taiwan and the mainland have been connected in real terms only in the short 4 years from 1945 to 1949. The vast majority of people simply don't know what the mainland is, so the door is closed. When the door was slowly opened again, Taiwanese were already looking at the mainland with curiosity from another colored perspective because of the influence of their long-term counterattack on the mainland's political education and propaganda. I don't intend to repeat the history of the so-called tragedies in Taiwan. In fact, a major problem for Taiwanese is that they are too often indulged in their own so-called tragic history, and use too many tragic past events that touch themselves as a way to exclude other groups. The reason is why others can't understand Taiwanese people's thinking. From the perspective of the long river of history, this kind of tragedy is really nothing. Any era, any ethnic group, as large as a nation, has a similar history and memory of suffering. Not only Taiwan has it, but it is a little bit farther back, and the Jews have it in the past, and it is closer. There are also ethnic groups in the Balkans. In Asia, South Korea's bitter sea and deep hatred is widely known, and the mainland also has the memory of a century of national humiliation. Consciously, even now that technologically advanced satellites have been able to fly out of the solar system, such national tragedy still continues to occur, such as the current Africa and the current Kurdish people. But I don't like to mention the so-called long river of history and big wheel of history, because the small cry of individuals is always crushed in these heroic narratives that later generations regard as wind and cloud, and when the wind blows, the smoke disappears. Although these tragedies are an insignificant part of history, it is really nothing. No one would want to live in that tragic moment, because unfortunately, most of us will be crushed a group of people. Ernest Renan, a French historian of the Franco-Prussian War, published a famous speech entitled "What is a Nation?" Common suffering unites people better than joy, and grief is more important than victory for national memory valuable. What is more tragic than the tragedy is that everyone has similar tragedies, but they cannot tolerate the tragedies of the others, pretending that they do not exist. The Jews are far from their hometowns after their subjugation, and they have suffered discrimination and planned massacres for thousands of years. I understand the pain of the subjugation of the country. After the restoration of the country, they also persecuted the Palestinians and kicked them out of their homes. During the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, different countries and nationalities could tearfully tell their sorrows. No matter which side you listen to, it is very reasonable and worthy of sympathy. Human beings, there are too many examples like this. Sadness does not mean that human beings of different ethnic groups can understand each other, and sometimes it becomes a zero-sum between ethnic groups. People with a strong Taiwan often shout Taiwanese are in the first place. Similarly, the mainland also shouted Chinese people have stood up. After Taiwan was ceded, it was impossible for Taiwan to experience the century-old national humiliation. From its own standpoint, it only knew that the rulers of this land came and went, indulging in their own sorrow, while the mainland naturally it is also difficult to understand why Taiwan is indifferent to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It is because the people on this land of Taiwan, due to historical reasons, have gradually cultivated distrust of the regime and turned to the freedom, diversified protection. If the nation is an imaginary community, it is a pity that in the past 100 years or so, there have not been many carriers on both sides of the Taiwan Strait that can be imagined together. Looking back on the history of Taiwan, early pioneering immigrants, people from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou kept fighting with each other. When they faced the Cantonese Hakka people, they realized that they were from Fujian. When immigrants from Fujian and Guangdong met the Aborigines, they realized that they were Han. Japan occupied Taiwan, and they realized that they were Chinese. During the 50 years of Japan's rule of Taiwan, the Taiwanese realized that they were different from the native Japanese. After Taiwan's retreat, the Kuomintang came to accept Taiwan. Many Taiwanese were completely disappointed, and would rather believe in the past. The Japanese did better. In 1949, a large number of immigrants from other provinces came to Taiwan. From the very beginning, Taiwanese and other provinces had conflicts. Everyone is suffering the same haha. When the second and third generations are born, the provincial complex is getting weaker and weaker. You will find that, from 1895 to 1945, half a century, and from 1949 to the present, it is more than half a century. Every half century, 3 generations are born. No matter what era people are born in, history is in their minds. It is not easy to achieve a common historical memory, but it is a long construction process every time. The fact that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait have not had common historical experiences in the past 100 years or so does not mean that there will not be in the future. Fortunately, this era is the best era for more than 100 years on both sides of the strait. There will be a new generation of young people who will rise up. They do not have too many historical grievances and ideologies. More individualistic. Under the habit of collective narration, individualism is often regarded as selfish and deviant, but this kind of view ignores another very important aspect. After all, we are now in a relatively peaceful era. It is to appeal to one's own point of view, and to go further, one needs to learn to respect the ideas of different individuals in order to release and decompress the potential contradictions that are suppressed in the collective. Man finally has his own life and can choose to pursue what he wants to pursue. The greatest common denominator among the various ethnic groups in Taiwan is life. No matter how the regime changes, no matter how chaotic the politics, even under the tragedy, they must live on. Similarly, there are too many differences in values and ideologies between the two sides of the strait. Talk a few words without speculating, and there will be a quarrel, but everyone is living, leaving aside politics and other superstructured things, but you can find resonance in the most trivial and vulgar things. When I returned to Taiwan during the Chinese New Year, my sister and her family came back from the United States. I saw my 4-year-old niece singing and dancing there. I listened to it several times before I could clearly hear what he was singing, Little Apple. I was shocked and asked my sister, how can he sing Little Apple when you live in the United States? My sister took it for granted that many of her kindergarten classmates went to mainland China, and the whole family was listening to Little Apple, and he would naturally be able to sing after listening to it for a long time. In the past, people in Taiwan were always cautious about the news from the mainland. The mainland language appeared on TV. This is a cultural united front. Simplified characters appear in advertisements, which is a cultural invasion. I am wary of things in the cultural and entertainment field in mainland China, but Apple almost overnight occupied the streets and alleys of Taiwan. Everyone is singing and dancing. Taiwanese people are very fond of such a happy song. There is no power to fight. Even MTV, which claims to be the most green in Taiwan and is considered to be against every China, still sings Little Apple very happily. This is a very interesting phenomenon. In the past, various cultural exchange groups did not do it. Songziwing, Tanjing, and others failed to do it when they came to Taiwan to sing. The Siyi Descendants Choir came to Taiwan to sing. It didn't do much, but the most contemptible and vulgar Little Apple did it without bragging. The more things in life, the more resonant they can be. If we recall the past few years in a few decades, we will say I was also singing Little Apple that year, I was also watching King Lanling and Zhenju that year. Biography, even tacitly said with a smile, I was also waiting for Edison Chen's movie on New Year's Eve that year. With these common life experiences, then a historical memory belonging to the new generation on both sides of the strait is slowly being constructed. We are all so absorbed in our own historical emotions that we ignore that the other party also has a suffering journey. In his speech at the Hong Kong Book Fair, Long Yingtai proposed an era of great listening across different historical memories. A person's memory is his. Everyone may have different stories of suffering, different ethnic groups have different war experiences, and the two sides have different historical memories. These are all worthy of respect. We need to let go of our prejudices and listen to each other. Only by listening, we begin to learn tolerance and move toward reconciliation. In the past, we were all too accustomed to grand narratives, and sometimes they became incompatible emotional frameworks. Only when we recognize life and truly know how to respect daily necessities, will we slowly begin to share new stories from this point of view. If the 21st century is really the century of the Chinese people, it is not just about how strong the military and economic power are. The whole world is afraid of us. I hope to listen, tolerate, and reconcile, and become a model to inspire other people in the world. People and nations who are suffering. There is an old saying, no matter where the future goes, our blood is still thicker than water.